let's talk about thermoregulation. When we talk about thermoregulation, the first thing we have to think about is what's in our arsenal? What can we do? And in our arsenal are what we would call thermoeffectors, and they fall into three broad categories: heat loss, heat conservation, heat production. So let's just name a few of these. Heat loss are things such as panting, sweating, and vasodilation. And when I say vasodilation, what I mean is that the cutaneous skin vasodilation. So when you think about a person, think about just this outer shell. So we have a shell and we have a core. So shell and core. If the blood is in the core, it cannot exchange with the environment. So that would mean that you would conserve the heat of the blood. If the blood is in the shell, then there can be exchange. So you can lose heat to the environment. And that's what happens in vasodilation. So vasodilation, you're dilating the blood vessels of the skin. You're letting all your blood, letting lots of blood access to the outside so it can lose heat. Okay, so that's heat loss. Those are three big ways to lose heat. For conservation, we're talking about the opposite, vasoconstriction. And we should also mention, both for heat loss and conservation, that there are behavioral ways to do this. So for heat loss, there's a splaying posture, a posture that increases surface area. And then for heat conservation, there's huddling, any posture that decreases surface area. And there's even better than huddling by yourself is huddling with more individuals. So these are all things that you can conserve your heat together. Heat production, we have a way to do that, and so we can increase metabolic rate, we can shiver, and we can move around, use skeletal muscles, which is related to shivering. So, okay, so what's not on this list? What's not on this list is we don't have a body's version of Freon. We can't produce a cold. So that means that if you think about temperatures from very hot to very cold, we're thinking about heat defense, and here we're thinking about cold defense. Defense against cold or defense against hot. Well, if you're thinking about very cold, you can conserve or produce heat. And then you can get rid of heat as it gets towards in the warm department, but when it gets very hot, you're out of luck. You don't have a way to refrigerate. And so this is a very important biological concept, which is that cold is dangerous, cold needs to be addressed, but too hot is lethal. It's simply lethal. We just don't have a biological mechanism to deal with extreme heat, which is why as we encounter hotter and hotter temperatures in the world, air conditioning, access to air conditioning, access to cooled environments is not a luxury. It's a biological necessity. It is an increasingly, so when you get to 90, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, which is roughly 40, no, it's not. It's around 38 degrees centigrade, I believe. Then the ability to lose heat to the environment decreases. Core body temperature may be core body temperature is 98 degrees, but the shell, your skin temperature is quite a bit lower than that. It's around 90 degrees on a really, really hot day. So your ability to lose heat into the environment is going to be compromised. When you get to, say, 95, 100, when you get over 40 degrees centigrade, you just you cannot lose heat to the environment unless you're in a cooled environment, an artificially cooled environment. This problem is exacerbated for people, for the elderly and for people on certain medications that have diminished the thermoregulatory response in response to heat. So this is not a luxury. This is a biological necessity to provide. Governments need to provide access to cool environments in extreme heat waves. Okay. So let's now look at how, under normal circumstances, when you're at sort of regular room temperatures in centigrade, we're talking, say, 20 to 25 degrees centigrade, which is, I guess, around 70 to 80 to 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. I think that's about right. So what do we do? Oops. So this shows you what we do during these sort of neutral, non-challenging environments. We have a core body temperature which stays within this narrow zone, which is about a half a degree centigrade. And if let's say all of a sudden somebody opens the window and it gets really cold, you stay within this range, and the way you do it is using vasomotion. So to stay within this range, what you do is you decrease the amount of blood flow to your skin from the resting value, which is roughly 5%, to 0. Okay, so now you're bringing all your blood in, you're conserving that heat in response to this cold challenge. If it gets a little warmer, you might send a little more heat out to the skin. Okay, so under normal resting, non-challenging situations, you're just going to use vasomotion. Vasoconstriction when it gets a little cold, vasodilation when it gets a little hot. But within a pretty narrow range. Now let's say that there's a big stress, a big heat stress, for example, in this example. So in this situation, what happens is that now you dilate, and if the heat stress is enough that vasodilation is insufficient, what you now do is you have an active vasodilation, which is an active dilation dependent on cholinergic signaling. So it's distinct from this, which is a passive relaxation where the norepinephrine signal from the sympathetics is just withdrawn. So this is a passive relaxation, and this is an active dilation. And when you get to this situation, you also bring in the big guns. And the big guns in responding to a heat stress is sweating. Sweating can take you down about 2.5 degrees centigrade in well under 5 minutes, in just a few minutes. So this is a normal way of responding to cold stress and heat stress. Now I want to just go into one scenario. Let's say that the cold stress is it's a big cold stress. You're not inside anymore. You're outside. And now vasomotion is, so the minute you go outside on a really cold Chicago day, winter day, you're going to be vasoconstricted, right? So you're going to pull in all that blood from the skin, and it's going to go to the core, away from the shell. You're not going to exchange heat. You're not going to lose heat to the environment. And then you're not wearing a hat. And then what do you notice? You notice that your ears turn red. Why do your ears turn red? Well, there is something called paradoxical vasodilation. And in paradoxical vasodilation, blood is sent to, even though it's really, really cold, and you would think that blood would, the skin blood vessels would be constricted, they are paradoxically dilated, and the good consequence of that is that you don't get frostbite. Okay? So this is a way in which you prevent exposed areas, particularly exposed areas with a high surface area to volume ratio, such as the ear, such as the nose, such as the fingers. You prevent them from getting so cold that they are actually damaged. And I think I have a picture of that. Yeah. So here's me. I went outside with this was a few winters ago, and I had on gloves that had no, or I had on mittens that had no fingers to them. So I was covering my palm, but not my fingers, and you can see that my fingers are vasodilated. Okay? So there is paradoxical vasodilation in the extreme cold. Interestingly enough, we don't have paradoxical vasoconstriction in extreme hot. We just don't have that. That's not a mechanism. It never evolved. And that means that in the extreme hot, you will still be vasodilated, which means if the environment is hotter than you are going to be taking in additional heat. Okay, this is another reason why this is such a big, heat is such a big problem, a biological problem. And I just want to mention that this is simply not understood by a lot of people. And this was a case about 5 years ago where some inmates in a Texas prison died because they did not have any air conditioning, and when their body temperature rose above 105 degrees because it was really, really hot that summer. And somebody said many inmates are poorly equipped to manage their lives and thus make poor decisions. I do not believe it is up to the taxpayers to provide air conditioning for inmates when some simple self-discipline would avoid many of these problems. And I would just explain to you that that is simply not a biologically correct statement. There's nothing that self-discipline or any willful action can do about the fact that you're going to overheat in a hot environment. Okay. So the final thing that I want to discuss about thermoregulation is fever. And fever is different from, so fever is not a change so much in the temperature of the individual, but it's a change in what we can call the set point. So let's say under normal circumstances, your set point is 98 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you get an infection, and now let's say your set point is up to 102. Well, that means that the body is now, instead of defending 98, it's going to now defend 102. Okay, so if the hypothalamus gets information about what the core body temperature is, and it has neurons that, in ways that we still don't understand, code for what the core body temperature should be. If those two things don't match, it will put out effector mechanisms to get there. And so if you're 98 but you have a fever, you will go and make yourself to be 102 or whatever the new set point is. How will you do it? You will vasoconstrict, you'll get pale, you'll shiver, you'll increase your metabolic rate, etc. And that is called pyresis. That's the fancy name for fever. You've elevated your set point. During this time, the subjective experience is that you are cold. you're not cold. I mean, you're actually, core body temperature is elevated, but you feel cold because your experience, your subjective experience, is only in relationship to the set point. So if you're below the set point, you're going to feel too cold. Then along comes, you either get lucky or you take a drug such as aspirin, and you have antiparesis, in which case, which means that not that your temperature it's not about your temperature, it's that your set point returns to normal. And when your set point returns to normal, all of a sudden, you throw off the covers, you start to sweat, you're vasodilated, and you feel really, really hot because your body temperature is above the set point. Okay, so that's a fever. Now, we do not have a regulated lowering of core body temperature, with one exception, which I'll touch on in a further video. But we do have situations where the temperature of the body deviates from the set point. The set point is normal, so normal set point for an awake adult is around 37 degrees centigrade, 98 Fahrenheit. And if your temperature is above that, that would be called hyperthermia. As long as the set point's the normal, but the temperature's above it, it's hyperthermia. And if the body temperature is below that set point, it's hypothermia. So hyperthermia happens when people get really overheated from exercise. They cannot blow off enough. They exercise in a very warm environment. That's a common reason why people get hyperthermia. People get it, for example, when they run marathons, particularly on warm days. And then hypothermia can happen when, for example, people fall into very cold environments, such as a cold lake. Now, if you gave a person with hyperthermia aspirin, would that help? Well, not so much. And if you gave a person with a fever, if you iced them down, would that help? Well, in fact, that may even hurt, because consider that the person with a fever has this elevated set point. And now, if you artificially lower their body temperature, they're going to just try harder to get to their elevated elevated set point. So you really need to be able to distinguish between a fever and a hyperthermia, because the treatments are different. At some point, a body gets too hot, and antipyretic, so a person with a fever gets too hot, and so antipyretic treatment has to be combined with cooling down the body. But it's important to understand the differences and apply antipyretics and apply cooling techniques in the appropriate situations. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the regulation of blood pressure.